All right, and as you're joining us, welcome. I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Dr. Gwen Adshead and Eileen Horn discussing The Devil You Know, Stories of Human Cruelty and Compassion. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. We do want to thank all of you out there for joining us this afternoon. We're very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce this incredible book. What drives someone to commit an act of terrible violence? Drawing from her 30 years experience in working with people who have committed serious offenses, Dr. Gwen Adshead provides fresh and surprising insights into violence and the mind. Through a collaboration with co-author Eileen Horn, Dr. Adshead brings her extraordinary career to life in a series of unflinching portraits. Alongside doctor and patient, we discover that human cruelty, ranging from serial homicide to stalking, arson, or sexual offending, means to perpetrators experiencing firsthand how minds can change when the people some might label as evil are able to take responsibility for their life stories and get to know their own minds. With outcomes ranging from hope to despair, from denial to recovery, these men and women are revealed in all their complexity and shared humanity. In this era of mass incarceration, deep cuts in mental health care, and extreme social schisms, this book offers a persuasive argument for compassion over condemnation. Moving, thought-provoking, and brilliantly told, The Devil You Know is a rare and timely book with the power to transform our ideas about cruelty and violence and to radically expand the limits of empathy. Author Dr. Gwen Adshead is one of the UK's leading forensic psychiatrists and psychotherapists. She has spent 30 years working in Broadmoor, England's largest secure psychiatric hospital, with groups and individual patients convicted of serious violent offenses, as well as with people in prisons and in the community. She has a master's degree in medical law and ethics and has published several academic books and over 100 papers and commissioned articles on forensic psychotherapy, moral reasoning and ethics, and attachment theory. She's a founding member of the International Association for Forensic Psychotherapy and has been a visiting professor at Yale University at Gresham College in the UK. And Eileen Horn is an American author and dramatist currently based in California with an MA in creative writing from the University of London. Following a long career in the UK as an independent TV drama producer, over the last decade, she has written an eclectic mix of historical nonfiction, journalism, Italian translation, as well as several original dramas and literary adaptations, including contributing to a BBC radio drama series about an entirely fictional female forensic psychiatrist. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gwen Adshead and Eileen Horn. Thank you both so much.
Thanks very much, Julia. My name is Eileen Horn, and I'm glad to be with you all today. I guess I would say I am you for the purposes of this session and also for the purposes of writing this book with Gwen, because I'm a layperson. I really knew very little about what Gwen's work was, although we'd been friends for a long time, and certainly had no insight into the surprises in the criminal mind that she offered me as we worked together. So as I did when writing the book, today I'm going to try and just ask a few questions and talk about changing minds, which is what happens in psychotherapy, but it's also what's happened to me as a writer and as a human being in the course of working with Gwen. I will tell you up front that I will never watch a Netflix true crime drama or a serial killer movie in the same way again. You've actually ruined my viewing, Gwen, because I'm so critical now. So I hope we're offering you all an opportunity to change your minds today. And maybe it's best if we start with the real basics, Gwen, if you just talk a little bit about what you do. What is a forensic psychiatrist? And unusually, you're also qualified as a forensic psychotherapist. Perhaps you could explain what that means.
Of course, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you all, and it's a real treat for me to be here also with Eileen, because we don't often get to present together, so this is a real treat for me. So in the UK, a forensic psychiatrist is a little bit different from the forensic psychiatrist in the US. In the US, a forensic psychiatrist is a psychiatrist who gives evidence in court in different ways. And that's true in the UK also, but in the UK, a forensic psychiatrist is someone who also offers clinical care to people who've committed violent offences when they've been mentally ill. So as well as maybe giving evidence about their mental states in court, a forensic psychiatrist is also someone who is going to admit somebody to a psychiatric ward, going to offer a treatment regime, going to coordinate their care, going to generally look after them and help them recover their mental health, as well as thinking about how to reduce their risk. And it's really it was really because I wanted to know more about how people change their minds to become safer that I decided to train as a psychotherapist as well. So I've worked sort of on and off, mixing those roles together. Sometimes I've looked after a ward full of patients and I've been their doctor in the hospital. And sometimes I've worked with people as a therapist, either a co-therapist running group therapy. I'm trained as a group therapist and I love running therapy groups. But I also work with people individually. And I'm interested in all kinds of therapy. I'm interested in a form of therapy called mentalization-based therapy, but I'm also very interested in mindfulness-based therapy, and I suspect many people listening will have some experience of mindfulness-based interventions, which are really very interesting, I think, in this context. So that's my background, and of course, like all psychiatrists, I trained as a doctor first, and was drawn to this work really because I was interested in law and I was interested in ethics.
So Gwen, one of the first things I remember we talked about when we embarked on this project together, I'm sort of interviewing you, and I said, you know, what happens at dinner parties or at the school gates when you say what you do? And you said to me, and actually you write about this in the introduction, you know, a lot of people say, you mean you actually try and help these people, but they're crazy, or, you know, why bother? And eventually, as you say in the introduction, after enough people sort of attacked you for or criticized you for trying to help them, you just pretend that you're a florist. It makes those dinner parties go a little more smoothly. But I wonder if you could just address that. You know, why bother, and what difference does it make? Oh, I think you've frozen. Come back, Gwen.
Well, I think.
There you go.
Yes, I'm afraid my my internet is unstable, which I hope is not an indication of my mental state. So please excuse me. But the and it is undoubtedly true. Eileen is absolutely correct that I have over the years, sometimes, usually on aeroplanes, mainly when I really don't want to engage in conversation, I have told people that I was a florist because I've occasionally got into conversations that were a bit heated, or not heated exactly, but a bit tense, perhaps. Because I think it's true that sometimes when I describe what I do, it is true that people sometimes say, sort of express revulsion. How can you possibly do that? How can you want to spend time with those people? Surely they don't deserve any help. But my response to this is always that actually it's in all our interests that such people get help. First, because it's humane to treat people who are mentally unwell to try and help them recover their mental health. But second, and perhaps even more importantly, if we're really interested in reducing people's risk to others, then we really want to maximize their mental health, because the chances are that if they're in a mentally healthy state of mind, then that's going to help to reduce their risk. And we talk in the book, don't we, Eileen, about the risk factors for violence in a model that we've called the bicycle log, which actually was an idea developed by a wonderful colleague of mine called Peter Aylward, who worked with me at Broadmoor. And we know that severe mental illness can be a rare and unusual risk factor for violence. It's not common. Most people with mental illnesses will never be violent to anyone. But just occasionally, people with severe mental illness, that severe mental illness can be a risk factor when combined with other things. So our argument is always providing treatment, therapy for violent offenders is a really important part of risk reduction in the future. That's my argument always.
Maybe it would be helpful for people who are, wondering if they should buy the book, wondering if it's for them. Some friends of mine have said to me, "Oh, I don't like that kind of dark stuff about serial killers." To sort of contextualize it or explain how we approached it. Obviously, you have this distinguished background as an academic, and you've written lots of papers and so on. And I know that you had long wanted to write about, if you like, the nature of evil. And I remember sitting in a cafe with you many years ago, and you said to me, "Yes, I think I want to write a book called A Short Book About Evil." And I went, "Ooh, good title." And you had all these ideas about you were going to write like 7 essays looking at the different nature of, different aspects of your work and so on. And I went, "Oh, that sounds really good. I would read that." But I don't know that, millions of people would read that
Nope.
because it might be too intellectual. And really when we, well, they might, I don't know.
Yeah.
But really when we decided to join forces, it was because I had a feeling that it was really important that you got it out there, got out your experience out to the world after 30 years of doing this job, and explained your insights, because I found them consistently astounding when you gave them to me over tea. So we talked about telling stories. I mean, after all, that's what you're encouraging your patients to do. And I guess that's why the collaboration. The book takes the form of 11 stories. I come from a film and TV background, so I always describe them as sort of little short films. But another way of looking at it perhaps is, when you watch one of those true crime shows on Netflix or whatever, at the end, the guy in the orange jumpsuit is led out looking abashed, facing his future in prison or possibly, the death penalty if you're in America. And what happens then? What happens to the guy after that? So these stories are meant to be what happens as the judge passes sentence and the gates slam shut. Well, if he's fortunate enough, that man in Britain certainly may have an opportunity, depending on his circumstances, to sit with you. So the book is an invitation, as you said, to come into the therapy room with you and different people. Do you want to describe a little bit for people the sorts of cases that we chose and how we developed them, how many men, how many women, what their crimes were? Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, I mean, you're very kind, Eileen, because, of course, what I remember telling you over that lovely cup of tea we had was how difficult it was for me to write the short book about evil, that actually I found that I couldn't really find the right voice at all to make it clear. It was really not working at all. And you very smartly said that actually there might be a way to do it through stories, because we were saying to each other, weren't we, that actually the very first people who wrote about violence, about serious violence and what goes on in the mind of perpetrators of serious violence, are in prose and in plays and in poetry. The Greek tragedies, the Shakespearean tragedies, which I absolutely love and have been really very influential for me. I mean, Shakespeare was one of our earliest forensic psychologists, really. And Macbeth is one of the best descriptions of domestic homicide, that I know. I am afraid to think what I have done. That is exactly a description of what many of the people that I work with describe. So your idea that we could start to create stories was really important for me, really, and it meant that we took a completely different approach, didn't we? That we began to see the book as an invitation to come and see what I see, come and see what happens when the judge is given the sentence, when the person's been admitted to prison, and the door shuts and the man arrives on the ward, or indeed the woman arrives in the prison cell, and what happens next, and what happens when they get referred to people like me, and what happens when I walk in and say, hello, I'm Dr. Adshead, shall we sit down and talk? And I wanted to invite people to come in and see what I see, and to get close to the world that I get close to in the same way. So, but using stories was seemed like it was going to make it really come alive in a much better way than my academic writing could ever do. And it was also crucial around the issue of confidentiality. And I wonder whether, Eileen, you might say a bit about that, because it was absolutely crucial to the co-authorship that you had this role of creating.
Well, I mean, I think lots of people watching today will have read Oliver Sacks or even Sigmund Freud or any number of other great practitioners, and they often tell clinical vignettes. So they change someone's name and a little bit about their look or circumstances, and then, you know, they just describe patients they've treated. And I thought it was as simple as that. And Gwen pointed out that there was no way she could do that, because she would be seen to be profiting from pain in some way if she just sort of changed the names to protect the guilty or something, and that it was insensitive to victims and their families, and indeed the families of the perpetrators, to do something where a person might be recognized. And I had to go away and puzzle over that, and puzzle's the right word, because I came back and said, well, what if we do something like a jigsaw? I'm quite keen on jigsaws. What if we do something like a jigsaw where you tell me, I don't know, let's say we have a chapter about a stalker, for example, a female stalker. I knew that you had treated a dozen or more women who had chronic problems in that compulsive behavior area. And I said, if you told me about all of them, and then we sort of wove them together, took a piece of that person, a piece of that person, and a piece of that person, we could create, I think in the book we call it Mosaic Portraits, which is a bit fancy. So create a jigsaw picture of someone. And crucially, what they looked like could not be up to you, because subliminally or accidentally you might say, oh, you know, he had curly black hair, and someone you treated who'd done a similar crime might well have had curly black hair, and you didn't mean to say it was that exact person. So I always said, don't tell me don't tell me what they look like. I will make up what they look like. Between you and me and the rest of Zoom, I will tell you that one of the characters, one of the composites in one of the chapters looks an awful lot like an ex-boyfriend of mine, but I am not going to tell you which one. And that was a way of protecting privacy, and also, you know, proceeding in a way that was ethically comfortable for you, I think. Have I got that right? Oh, you've frozen up again. Well, I'll give an example of that while we're waiting for Gwen to become stable again. So the chapter about the stalker, Lydia. There you are. You're back. I was just talking about Lydia. The chapter about the female stalker is a middle-class woman of Gwen's age, who stalked her former therapist, which might make therapy with her feel very uncomfortable. And therefore, we had to be really careful, because Gwen has treated someone with some of that profile, an actual person, and draw lots of elements of the story from several other women. And that was easy enough, partly because, rather like other obsessive compulsive behavior, people who are stalkers are not very original. They almost have a script, and they tend to do the same thing as each other. So that composite had that challenge. If we take something like a serial killer, the first chapter in the book is about a guy called Tony, who we've called Tony, nobody's real name, who is a multiple homicide perpetrator, to use the appropriate term. And he is based on a couple of patients that Gwen treated, but also cases that she'd read about with colleagues or worked with colleagues on, because there aren't that many serial killers, certainly not in England. in fact, this was one of the big learnings for me. I know we're all really interested in serial killers for some reason, is that they're so rare. I mean, homicide itself is an incredibly rare way to deal with your feelings or of rage or despair. Relatively rare. It may come as some surprise to you, but serial killing is vanishingly rare, and particularly in England, where we have about, I think it's a tenth as many serial killers in modern history as there are in America. Gwen, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. I was fascinated in your observations about serial killers in America. Are you there?
I'm back. I'm back now. I've turned my video. I've turned my video off in what I suspect is a vain attempt to try and.
Uh-oh. Oh, technology. Are you there?
If she's frozen and we can't see her, I've asked her to start video again, so hopefully we can get that back up and running.
Okay. Hello.
As Dr. Gwen works on it, though, perhaps Eileen, maybe you could share with us a little bit more about your last thought.
Yeah, because I'm American, although I've lived in Europe most of my life, I wanted to know as soon as I saw the statistics, and of course there are lots of disagreements among the different statisticians about this. The exact numbers vary wildly depending who you're reading, but there were so many more serial killers in America. And at first I thought that was because of the gun legislation in America, but it really isn't. Serial killers aren't always killing people with guns. So I asked Gwen what she thought the reason was, and she said, well, for one thing, I think Americans are more open about their problems, which I thought was fascinating, certainly more than the reserved British. And so maybe they report more when these things happen. For example, when we looked up different studies to see how many serial killers there had been in China, a much more, to use a generalization, secretive culture, they said there'd been 2 serial killers ever in China, which is kind of strange in a population of that size. And yet, 5,000 in America, or that's one set of figures. There's so many. Another thing that Gwen talked about was that in America, it's so easy to get lost. And she was referring to the victim as well as to the perpetrator. It's a big geography. You can move easily over borders in a way that you can't say, for example, in Europe. And so you can move between states if you need to get out, and so on. So that was one factor. Although within that, she noted that they're on the decline. Hate to disappoint all the filmmakers out there. The numbers are falling sharply in the age of the technological revolution. Social media and mobile phones and CCTV, almost universal, let's say, observation of each other, has made it more difficult to disappear. Has made it more easy, and has made it a lot easier to track people as well, both victims and perpetrators. So yeah, those were some of the reasons. We also talked about the American tendency to be kind of every man out for himself, which I really noticed coming back here after a long time abroad, and that sense of, let's call it, to be kind, rugged individualism, and maybe not getting too nosy about what your neighbor might be up to, because every man is an island, and maybe that helps some serial killers. Slightly making that up now. Hopefully Gwen she's just texted me. Hopefully she's able to get back on.
Yeah, we've heard from our tech support as well. We are trying to get Dr. Gwen back on. We all know the wonders of Zoom. I'm very fascinated, though, about sort of the idea of American individualism as we know it, sort of not directly stemming, and here's Dr. Gwen, but sort of feeding into the higher amounts of serial homicides that we have in this country. Hello, Dr. Gwen.
Hi, I'm really sorry about this. I think it may be the heat.
Let's blame global warming. Global warming.
Well, in England, it's so unusual that I think my the Wi-Fi is collapsing all over Berkshire. So how far have you guys got? with
Well, we've
serial
gone down
killers.
the rabbit hole of why America has the most serial killers. I mean, we could just, really spin out on this, so I don't want to spend too much time here. But I remember that early conversation when we were writing the first chapter about Tony. And in every chapter, I should say, we try and not just write about an English person doing a crime in England, but sort of let the ripples come out so that we look at people who've committed similar crimes in other countries so that it has a kind of global reach and you're speaking to a wide audience. And Gwen, you talked about the geography of America and whether that explained why there were more serial killers, as well as the openness of the American press, relatively speaking, and the openness of law enforcement, relatively speaking, but also about rugged individualism in America.
Yes.
And Julia's got fascinated with that. So I wonder if you could riff on that for a minute.
Yeah, I am very fascinated and I'm very excited to hear the riffing. I will duck away, but I do want to encourage our audience out there, go ahead and submit any questions you have for Dr. Gwen or Eileen into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for your questions shortly, but I'll disappear myself so I can hear about the rugged individualism.
Uh-oh. Are you ready, Gwen?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting theory. It's certainly been one of the theories about why there's been so many serial killers in the US. I think it has to be said that there must be something much more about the fact that we get to know about them. And I think, of course, the US did lead the world in some ways in developing police investigative techniques in terms of investigating violent crimes and the idea of connecting people up. And I think that's actually been fictionalized, hasn't it? In
Mindhunter.
Mindhunter,
Yes.
which my children always want me to watch, and I have watched a couple of episodes and complain it's like homework. But it is interesting. I mean, the development of the FBI and the development of the Quantico investigation was indeed very interesting because, in a way, this was the first step into thinking that the mind of the killer might be really important to understand if you want to reduce risk. So I think we really have Quantico and the development of the FBI when all that went with that to at least partly explain why we know so much more about serial killers in the USA. And I think that also, I do think that there is something about the vastness of the territory, the fact that people could often travel for very long distances. And of course, before the arrival of the internet and the mobile phone, it was possible for people to lead really very isolated and anonymous kind of lives. And to change identity perhaps more easily. And I've actually found myself wondering recently whether one of the reasons that we're so focused on identity and identity politics at present is because somehow it seems to me it's actually harder to change identity than it used to be. That actually in the past, and particularly 40 years ago, you could change your name, you could just sort of vanish, you could change all sorts of things about yourself, and it would be much harder to track you down. Whereas now it's actually quite hard to change an established identity, really, quite hard. And of course, I'm confident that one of the reasons that, for example, in Britain, one of the reasons that we have very few multiple homicide perpetrators is because the country is so much smaller. And there's just much more capacity for crime enforcement to interact with one another. But even then, back in the 80s, tracking down Mr. Sutcliffe was really tricky, and it took a long time for them to identify him, leads on him. So getting into the mind of someone who does cruel things is really important. And this is another reason, I guess, why I think our work is important, is because I think if we understand the minds of people who do these things, we might have a better shot at trying to prevent them in the future.
Gwen, can I just ask you something that, again, was one of those questions I had for you at the beginning, but that everyone asks me, even me as just your collaborator, but you're the one at the coalface. Isn't it hard getting inside the mind of a serial killer? I mean, or whoever, a stalker, a child sex offender, how do you manage that? How do you cope with sitting in these really quite small rooms, from what you've described to me, with people talking about the most extreme and violent and painful stuff? How does your training help you with that? What do you do? You there?
Well, I think, yeah, I am here. It's
Right.
just my Wi-Fi wobbling again. Well, I think I think my medical training is very important in this context, because it is a very important part of the medical training to learn to be present in the face of traumatic events, and events that normally are not shared with others. So something about private, intimate, traumatic kind of events is key to a lot of medical practice, and you have to learn as part of your medical training to manage your emotional responses to those things. But also there are a couple of other things that I think are quite important here. One is that I am there because I want to be. I am really interested in what makes people do bad things, as well also in what makes people do good things. I'm interested in moral philosophy. I'm interested in how people make choices that we call quotes good or quotes bad. And I'm particularly interested in how people can come to let themselves do something that they know to be wrong. And so it seems to me that I chose this career in order so that I could understand that. But the third factor is also that when I'm working in a prison or in a secure psychiatric hospital, the danger is now neutralized. The people that I'm working with have no interest in attacking me. In fact, they know that I'm there to try and help them. They know that I'm there to get close and understand, but also to just keep my distance as well. And they have no interest in attacking me. They don't have to see me. They can refuse to see me, and people do refuse to see me, but the people who want to see me, they're not going to attack me. So I'm not frightened at what's going to happen to me. What I do think is sometimes very hard, is just sometimes the sadness of these stories. Sometimes the sadness of terrible damage done that you can't make better. And that I think is very sad. I'm involved in a case at the moment with a young man who killed 3 people when he was grievously mentally ill. And this, of course, this terrible, terrible event has massive ramifications, not obviously for him and his family, but also for the poor people he killed and their families, and the village in which they lived, and the environments, and everybody who's affected by it, and the ripples go on and on. So I think it's the sadness of it, actually, that I find most worrying sometimes. That's the thing that stays with me perhaps most.
Can you just talk about the idea that we describe in the book of radical empathy? I think radical everything has just become such a kind of catchphrase, internet meme almost. And I wonder if the ideas you've developed around that in your training and kind of learned on the job the hard way would be interesting for people to hear just a bit more about this idea of radical empathy, as opposed to bleeding heart liberal hugging criminals, I mean.
Well, I think the first thing that's been very important to me is my understanding of my role, of my understanding of the work, is that my work is there to help this person become less risky to other people, to become well in themselves, but also to become less risky in the future. And it is therefore, I have no role in making them feel better about what they've done. I have no role in excusing what they've done, or saying or minimizing its cruelty. In fact, that would be to betray the work. Ultimately, that would be to let this person down. If I'm not serious with him, and they nearly always are him, if I'm not serious with this man about what he's done and to really take that seriously, then I'm no use to him. The work will be no use to him. So it's really absolutely important that I don't go into the work in any way minimizing or neutralizing or excusing. And in generating, in working with a man who's perpetrated serious violence, or indeed a woman, it's about trying to get to how they came to let themselves do that, how they came to take control and bring that about, that I am them taking them seriously as persons with agency, as people who make choices, not just things. But there is no part of the explanation that is in any way an excuse. And they know that. And interestingly, I mean, I've had conversations with people where we've been talking about their terrible childhoods and trying to explore how the experience of terrible childhood adversity might have contributed to their violence risk later. And I've lost count of a number of people who said to me, well, this is no good. I know people who have terrible childhoods just like mine, and they haven't done what I've done. So where does that take us? How does that take us anywhere? And that's a good point, because we know that there is a link between early childhood adversity and later violence. But quite how it works, we still don't know. It's a fascinating area of research, again, once led by American colleagues, developed in the 1990s, of the importance of childhood adversity and its impact on poor physical and mental health in adulthood. That was really important work that was done by in the 1990s in the States, and is now a worldwide recognition at a public health level that we need to do something about childhood adversity. But the link with violence is complicated, because while most violence perpetrators have had really terrible childhoods, most people who have really terrible childhoods don't go on to be violence perpetrators. So we've got something really complicated and interesting here, which is what you'd expect with a human mind. A human mind is really complicated. Like in the book where we talk about it like a coral reef, an ocean with deep, deep layers and shadows and darkness. It's complicated. It is not like a computer. It's the one thing your mind is not like. It is not like a computer. And we should expect human minds to be complicated, and violence is complicated.
Gwen, can I just pick you up on something you said there? You said, oh, they're mostly men. I was prepared when we started work on this, and we were trying to figure out which stories we would include about which kinds of violence and who perpetrated them. I was prepared that maybe one or two of them would be female and the rest would be men, because that would be accurate. But you argued, I think very rightly, because you worked with so many violent women, and because let's say in the public discourse, people don't really want to address violent women and find it distasteful, that we should have half as many women as men in the book. And we ended up doing that, which I think will surprise perhaps even your fellow practitioners. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about whether, as people often ask me, do you think that women are less violent than men? 5%, 10% of all violent crime is committed by women compared to men. Why is that? Is it biological? What's your experience of that gender divide?
Well, that's a Nobel Prize winning question, Eileen, and no, but I don't think it's going to be solved by me. But so you have to start by just looking at the straight facts, which is that there is no country in the world, absolutely no country in the world, where men don't form the majority of violence perpetrators. So it's unusual for women to commit acts of serious violence. But my experience is that when women are violent, the violence is not all that dissimilar to male violence. It's just that it seems to take more to get women there. So their violence is commonly towards people whom they're in relationships with. That's common for men too. Their violence is often fueled by substance misuse. That's common for men too. They've often been exposed to serious childhood trauma. That's true for men too. The only thing that differs really is that adult women usually have had experience of domestic violence as well. But since there are an awful lot of women who suffer domestic violence and very few of them go on to be violent themselves, that's probably not going to be much help as a risk factor. But I think I find myself really worrying about the mirror image, really, which is there something about the Y chromosome that makes people vulnerable, that makes men vulnerable somehow to being willing to embody violent cruelty and anger in a way that women don't. So there's something here for me about embodiment and the different use of men and women's bodies. But clearly, I favor an explanation based around gender roles. I just think that for men, there is a kind of account of masculinity which normalizes the use of violence, and particularly normalizes the use of violence with anyone who you either view as a possession or you view as somehow threatening your superiority, as a kind of dominance regulator, a dominance and status regulator. And I think that if you grow up with that kind of vision of what it is to be a man, that you are allowed to use violence to control your possessions, by which I include people, or you are allowed to attack anybody who threatens your dominance, then if you grow up with that vision, then you're going to be at high risk of violence. And then if you add in all the other things like childhood adversity and substance misuse, serious mental illness, and of course the drug misuse sometimes causes the mental illness. So there's nothing quite like cocaine and amphetamines for making you way paranoid. But paranoia, severe paranoia, is a massive risk factor for violence. So you can see how these things then come together in a complicated story. I mean, the good news is that most people with a Y chromosome will never be violent to anyone. But it does seem that if you're going to draw a picture of a violence perpetrator, they are more likely to be male. But I actually think that when women are violent, the violence looks pretty similar, and the cruelty is pretty similar too. It's just on a much smaller numeric scale.
I found that fascinating and really eye-opening as we were working together on this book. I just we should open up to questions in a minute, but because this bookshop is called Politics and Prose, I have a prose question and a political question for you, or topic really. You talked a little bit earlier about Shakespeare and being the first forensic psychiatrist, and I love that idea, of course, as a dramatist myself. But I also know that you're a big fan of crime fiction, and I wonder if you could talk to people a little bit about why you love crime fiction and how you think that's affected your work, or if at all, and any crime authors that you think are particularly good on writing about inside the criminal mind.
Well, I do love crime fiction, and my favorite writer is P.D. James, I think. I also like Dorothy L. Sayers and Agatha Christie. I have a big, Agatha Christie was one of the first books I read as a child, and she is a great plotter, she's a great narrative writer, and she's very interesting because she played around she wrote over the course of about 3 decades, and she played around with theories of what makes people kill, with lots of different ideas reflecting the ideas of the times. And she was very interesting. She can be very interesting on on the kind of theory that mental disorder explains all crime, because she was writing at a time when people were trying to claim that we'd find out that the brain was a kind of mechanism that's broken. If you just find the mechanism, just find the break, you'll be able to explain all violence. So she was doubtful about that. And P.D. James is the kind of her literary inheritress, I think. And I like them, I guess, because a bit like us in forensic psychiatry and psychotherapy, they're trying to bring order to a disordered universe. And every person I meet, all of my patients, are disordered universes, a disordered cosmos in miniature. And there is that about the work as a psychotherapist in trying to bring order to chaos in a journey with the patient. So there's something for me about why done it. And the why done it, of course, is important to the criminal fiction writer also. So that's probably one of the reasons I like it. And if people haven't come across P.D. James, then I really recommend it.
Absolutely. Innocent Blood, highly recommend. Brilliant novel. Okay, here's my political question, and then I guess we should open up to the listeners. So here it is. If you were Queen of America, which I think should be a job, if you were Queen of America, what's one thing you would do for us in the realm of healthcare or justice reform? Just one thing.
Just one thing. So that's an easy question, Eileen.
Imagine there's no Congress. Imagine you could do whatever you want. A magic wand. Queen of America.
With ultimate power comes ultimate responsibility. I guess there are 2 things really. I would invite people to review the literature, the issue on sentencing and mandatory minimums, and the length of sentences. I would invite a root and branch review of that. And I would obviously include, and I have to say, I would absolutely include the abolition of the death penalty everywhere right now, no more, none of that ever again. But I would also encourage massive, big investment in the rehabilitation of offenders. So, let them vote, let them have housing, let them have jobs. Stop adding further punishment to people who've served a sentence. serving sentence, I have no problem with. And the people I work with have no problem with either. They will tell you, I've done my crime, I need to do my time. I'm always amazed at how people are absolutely up for that. I've very rarely met anybody who said, if they'd admitted to the offence, they weren't up for doing their time. But I think the punishment should stop with the time spent in prison. And once you've done your time, you shouldn't be further penalised. You should be able to get housing. You should be able to get a job. You should be able to vote. You should be able to take your place again. And that's only good sense, really, in terms of recidivism. If you punish people more, you increase their chances of recidivism. And that's just wasteful. It's just wasteful. And I'm not sure that it's affordable. I'm not sure any of us are going to be able to afford it in the future. And perhaps not this generation, but the generations to come. I'm not sure that we can afford to spend this much money on incarcerating people indefinitely just because we feel so angry and hurt by them.
Thank you, Gwen. I nominate you Queen. I'll just end on this. We were talking to Julia before the event began about back in those days when we used to go into bookstores and choose a book from a shelf. I was wondering where our book might sit in her bookstore, because it's not really a medical memoir, although it does describe Gwen's learning journey and her experience of the changing world of the NHS, for example, in England over 30 years, and all the mistakes she made and the learning curve and so on. It's not
and
true
how.
crime. Yeah, really. And it's not true crime in the sense it's not gross descriptions of exploitative details of murders. That's just not what it is at all. And yet you couldn't call it, a psychotherapy case book, because there's an element of creative nonfiction here, and because it's not just reportage, where hopefully we take people on compelling individual journeys, much more like the short films I described early on. So, Julia, I guess what I would say is that if there's like a big round table in the middle of your bookshop, you could just put our book on there with no other books, and instead of shelving it, and then everyone would buy it when they walk in. That's my final thought. Thank you. And now we should turn it over to people's questions.
Thank the two of you so much for the discussion, and I will float the idea of a table singularly for this title.
Thank you.
To my betters at the bookstore. All right. So if you're tuning in, we'll move to our audience Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, you still have time to put that in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. We do have a few there already. So from two attendees, on a similar thought, Jay asks, were there any subjects or stories that tested your own ability to empathize? And another attendee asks more specifically, was one story in the book harder to write or live through than others?
Well, they are fantastic questions. Thank you so much. What great questions. If I start with the second one first, I think that there is a case story about a man who sexually abuses his sons. And so that's a trigger warning, perhaps, for people. As Eileen said, we worked very, very hard to ensure that such writing was not in any way salubrious or vicariously disturbing or traumatizing. But it was a difficult thing to write about. It was difficult to recollect. I used to run therapy groups for men who'd abused their children, and it was difficult to recollect, and it was difficult to write about. And I did worry most, I think, in some ways, about that chapter and about whether it would be distressing. So that, and you will appreciate that we've generally written about the people who wanted to work with me. But there are people who might start work with me and then decided they don't really like it, and they can be quite dismissive about the work, and that's sometimes hard. That's sometimes hard when people are dismissing or denigrating of the work. I think that's hard.
Actually, I would just add that one of the hardest stories, of course, writing about a child sex offender perhaps particularly because I'm a mother, I don't know. It's not fun, but it was just desperately sad. One of the most disturbing stories for me was actually a story about a man who was not in prison, who had not been convicted of anything, but who was a doctor. It's the final chapter in the book, and Gwen often does give a little bit of private therapy in the community to fellow medical practitioners, and he had done something terrible and wanted to confess only to her, thinking it would stay with her because of confidentiality. I found that terrifying because he was a family GP. I mean, he was just someone who could be your primary care physician and seemed like a very familiar type, as Gwen was describing. Actually, more than one doctor she'd treated, and we created this composite as usual, because I like to think of the bad guys as being in there, behind the wall. And here was this guy who you might meet this afternoon in a consulting room. I mean, it was really very disconcerting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I particularly wanted to make sure that we included a story about the use of child pornography and the downloading of child pornography, which is a massive industry. And literally millions of people as we speak are downloading images of children which have been created through abuse. And I think we have to think very carefully about an industry that creates offenders. All those people who download images become offenders, and people can get years for every image. Some states, as I'm sure you know, you can get 10 years for every image you've downloaded. But I think we have to ask ourselves about who is making this stuff. And do they not need, why are they not carrying some responsibility for creating this material and selling it to people in the same way as we raise serious questions about cocaine supply or heroin supply? So I think that, but I did also want to make the point that a lot of users of child pornography and indeed sex offenders within the family are nice people like us. People often are well-educated, thoughtful people who just seem to have this problem around letting themselves do something that they seem to feel sometimes compelled to do.
Thank you for those answers. We are streaming on YouTube, and we have a question that's somewhat related from someone viewing there. In your work with these subjects, in terms of them being people that you could meet on the street perhaps, or who is responsible, a user on YouTube is asking whether any of these subjects would try to manipulate you during your conversations, or did you find that they were honest or wanted to tell, or how did you sort of find that line?
Great question.
It is a great question, and the truth of it is that you don't know from the start. Sometimes you just the work and see where it goes. But I think perhaps the most important.
Uh-oh.
Dr. Gwen has cut out just a bit. We'll wait and see if she comes back to us. Eileen, did you have an answer for that question at all?
Work.
Oh, or is that Dr. Gwen?
And
Phew.
Okay.
Dr. Gwen, we have missed your answer.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
We can.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Or perhaps not.
Or perhaps not. Coming and going.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's my job to be Gwen's translator and ventriloquist. Anyway, that's my job. So what I would say, I'm not sure if she would express it exactly like this, of course, but is that she's trained, to read people, and train for many, many years. And of course, you're always learning, even when you've been doing it for 30 years, to look for signs. Sometimes that can come from people protesting too much, as in, oh, I feel so much remorse and regret. I'm really fine. Really, can you just sign something and help me get out of here? Sort of behavior, manipulative behavior. But also people who really try and pluck her heartstrings. I think Gwen has this, great wellspring of empathy and kindness, as you can tell. And she's obviously had to have rigorous training around that, partly therapy of her own. As you know, all psychotherapists go through a lot of therapy in order to train, and to know where her blind spots are, so that she's ready if someone is trying to manipulate her. And I think that's been really an important part of her practice, of course, as with all practitioners in her field. Don't know if Gwen's back.
No.
Are you there?
And Gwen's
I don't
back.
think so. I don't think you can hear me
Whoops.
at all now.
Yes, we can. Yes,
We can.
No, I can you can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Eileen. That is absolutely yeah, that's great. Well, I just wanted to add, because I was able to hear you, and I just wanted to add that perhaps the caller's question is really important, because the most important thing is keeping in mind the possibility that you are being manipulated.
Thank you for that. I think a good question maybe to end on, as we're nearing our hour's end. Someone asks, what can we do as individuals on a personal level and as citizens and activists at large to address human cruelty? So what can we do sort of in the immediate sphere, and then how should we think about sort of more systemic issues?
Can I jump in with something, Gwen? Can I jump in with something? Because I've just immediately thought of John Major, who you may remember was a British Prime Minister, and we quote him in the book. He said in some keynote speech while he was Prime Minister that we need to have more condemnation and less compassion, for God's sake, people. And we turned that around in the book and said we all need to have less condemnation and more compassion. And if you take that thought out into your day to day, and just when someone's cutting you off in traffic or getting in front of you in the queue at the bank or whatever the hell you're doing, and just think, wait, how can I treat this tiny moment with a little compassion rather than condemnation? It might make a tiny contribution. You know, I remember Mother Teresa once giving an interview, and someone said, why do you bother going out and hugging someone in a slum in Calcutta? And she said, because it's a drop in the ocean, and the ocean is made up of that many drops. You know, it's really important that we all do our little drop. So if you can have a drop of condemnation for someone today, I think that's at an individual level what's needed. I'll let Gwen answer the larger question.
Well, I don't know if will my Wi-Fi hold up, but I suppose what I would absolutely echo that, and I think something about practicing compassion for our own cruelty. I think our own capacity for anger, and just acknowledging that it's there inside all of us. And the good news is that most of us will probably never act on it, but when we do have those feelings of cruelty or rage or anger, just to look after them and to try and understand them, and to practice goodness where we can.
Thank you so much for those insightful answers. That one about practicing compassion for yourself is going to stick with me today, and just looking where that occurs. Many thanks to Dr. Gwen Adshead, Eileen Horn for being here, and our audience out there for tuning in with these thoughtful and engaging questions and dedication to bring you this incredible programming, and we simply couldn't do it without the book sales to support it. So you can follow the link in the chat to get your copy of The Devil You Know, Stories of Human Cruelty and Compassion, or just head on over to politics-prose.com. And you can check out our events calendar for everything else we've got coming up in the summer and the fall. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying strong, staying safe, and of course, staying well read. We'll see you next time. Dr. Gwen, Eileen Horn, we are so happy to have had you here. Thank you so much. And everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.